Mackenzie was sitting in the kitchen and she was kind of drying some dishes, and she looked out the window and she saw a little puppy or a little dog run by, and she thought, oh my goodness, Molly is out again. Molly is out. I've got to tell, because this is the little neighbor dog. So she yells to her mom, Mom, Molly got out. Can I go help get her? And Mom said, oh yeah, it's really cold out, so grab a coat. So Mackenzie goes in, grabs her coat, and goes out the door, and she's yelling, Molly, Molly. Molly is running. Molly's not even looking around at her. Molly. She runs a little bit more down the street, turns around, looks at her, and keeps running. Well, and then she turns the corner. Mackenzie is thinking, well, the dog's not even listening to me. So she goes down to the corner, keeps following little Molly, the dog, and Molly goes and crosses the street without looking. So Mackenzie's really worried, and she's thinking, Molly's gonna get hit by a car. Molly doesn't have any cares in the world. She's sniffing tires and sniffing all kinds of plants and stuff. And Mackenzie's really worried, and she's calling, and Molly's not paying any attention to her at all. Mackenzie thinks, do I go after the dog that's not listening, or do I go back and get Mrs. Lowe? So she decides, okay, the dog is not listening to me. I should go back and get Mrs. Lowe. So Mackenzie runs back down the street, knocks on Mrs. Lowe's door. Mrs. Lowe comes to the door. She's a little bit older, opens the door and goes, hi, Mackenzie. How are you? And Mackenzie goes, hi, I'm good. Your dog is running away. And Mrs. Lowe says, oh my goodness, let me get the leash. So Mrs. Lowe goes and gets the leash and gets her coat, and then asks Mackenzie, can I hold your arm as we go down the stairs? I'm not as young as I used to be, and I can't jump down them like you can. So Mrs. Lowe grabs Mackenzie's arms and they walk down the stairs, and then they start walking down the street. And Mrs. Lowe says, Mackenzie, can I hold your arm as we walk down the street? And Mackenzie's thinking, sure, yes, you can hold, but she's thinking, we're never gonna find this dog at this pace. This Molly has probably run far away by now. So they continue down the road. And Mrs. Lowe begins to explain to Mackenzie how little Molly likes to push out of the back gate. The back gate is kind of broken, and so Molly has figured out how to release herself from the yard. So they're going, and Mrs. Lowe is calling, Molly, Molly, darling, where are you? And Mackenzie is thinking, you know, there's no sound. The dog is not answering. There's no confirmation. There's no little barking. So they keep walking and walking, and Mrs. Lowe keeps calling, Molly, Molly, and they continue, and all of a sudden they hear woof, woof under a little bush, and out comes Molly, and Molly comes and sits down right in front of Mrs. Lowe, and Molly is wagging her tail, and Mrs. Lowe says, oh good, quickly snaps on the leash, and they begin walking home. And Mrs. Lowe is so thankful that Molly is found. And Mackenzie says to Mrs. Lowe, you know, it must be really frustrating for you to keep looking after and running after a dog that keeps running away. And Mrs. Lowe says, oh, it's no trouble. I don't mind looking after and trying to find Molly because I really love her and I'm really worried, and I'll get that gate fixed. But I always want her to be safe, and I'll always go looking for her when she's lost because I always want her to be okay, and I love her and I'll miss her terribly. So it's no problem at all. And even though Mrs. Lowe had a hard time walking, she was happy that Molly was found and would always go out and hunt for her precious little dog. So after everybody was safely away and Mrs. Lowe had Molly safely in the house and Mackenzie was back with Mummy, Mackenzie said to her mom, you know, I think Jesus is a lot like Mrs. Lowe. And Mom said, what do you mean? And she said, you know, Mrs. Lowe has no problem and loves to go out to find her dog because she loves that doggy, just like Jesus would always go out and look for us and always wants us to be safe from harm.